Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take a stack of sources, pull up the most fascinating insights, and help you get well-informed fast.
Great to be here.
Today, we're diving into a theory that, well, it really challenges everything you thought you knew about history.
It certainly does.
You know, the standard story, right? The glorious classical age, then boom, the Dark Ages, all stagnation and decline.
Yeah, sort of a historical trough.
Exactly. And then the triumphant, miraculous Renaissance. It all fits together so neatly.
Almost too neatly, perhaps. That's kind of the starting point here.
Precisely. Have you ever stopped and thought, is that maybe just a bit too perfect, a bit too convenient?
It's a compelling narrative, like a three-act play, clear progression. But what if, especially for those early periods, it's more of a constructed model than, than what really happened?
Right. And that's our mission in this deep dive, to unpack a theory that hits that conventional wisdom head on.
It's a pretty radical idea, suggesting the Dark Ages might have been, well, invented.
Invented. And even the classical age itself could be just a kind of phantom reflection of much later events, medieval events.
It flips a whole timeline on its head, a complete reevaluation.
So where are we getting this from? Tell us about the sources.
We're drawing from excerpts of a book called '04 Dark Ages in Medieval History. It's part of a bigger series, History, Fiction, or Science.
Okay.
And it comes from a Russian mathematician, Anatoly Fomenko, and his colleagues. It presents a, shall we say, very alternative view to accepted history.
A mathematician looking at history.
Oh.
Interesting. So let's get into the core argument, this new chronology, as it's called.
Right. The fundamental idea is that history, as we learn it, isn't necessarily the real past.
Yeah.
It's our model of the past. And that model is built from surviving records.
Okay. Makes sense so far.
But Fomenko argues that this model, particularly anything before, say, the 17th century, is fundamentally flawed, riddled with errors, maybe even deliberate misdatings.
So, like, most of recorded history needs a rethink.
Pretty much. A key concept they introduce is the veracious period. They say a truly verifiable history, where you can confidently pin down events with independent sources.
Yeah.
Only really begins around 1650 AD. Everything before that needs serious checking. Thorough research and chronological verification, as they put it. The records just aren't reliable enough on their own.
Wow, 1650. That's recent, historically speaking.
It cuts out a huge chunk of what we consider established history.
And they're saying this isn't just about the distant past, right? That history is still being created even now.
Exactly. Not a fixed thing, but a narrative that's constantly shaped. Sometimes for political reasons, sometimes cultural.
Any examples of that?
Well, they mention India looking to introduce its sort of more grandiose yet free from conflicts version of its past into schools.
Okay.
Or, and this is a big one, the claim that China's Great Wall was actually built after 1950.
Wait, after 1950? Seriously?
That's the claim. And that older drawings only pop up in European books, suggesting it wasn't seen as ancient in China until recently.
That's startling. What about other things, like inventions?
Yeah, they look at the printing press. We usually say, what, 15th century Germany?
Gutenberg. Right.
Right. But the new chronology finds it odd that printing molds were supposedly invented in China 300 years earlier, 11th century, and then just forgotten.
Yeah, that does seem a bit strange.
So they suggest maybe a European book on printing got translated into the Chinese later, maybe 17th century, and then got woven back into their history as an ancient invention.
Sort of backdating it?
Kind of. They even point to a supposed misprint from Napier's 1620 logarithm table showing up in a Chinese book thought to be 500 years older. Suggests the influence went the other way.
Okay, so why? Why would these historical adjustments happen? Is it just mistakes, or is it deliberate?
The theory leans more towards deliberate action. There's this core concept they call phantom duplicates.
Phantom duplicates. Sounds intriguing.
The idea isn't just that history repeats itself. It's that events we place before 900 AD are actually copies or echoes of things that happened much later between the 10th and 17th centuries.
So, like, the story of ancient Rome might actually be a retelling of something that happened in medieval times.
That's the implication.
Yeah.
That entire chunks of medieval history were artificially pushed back in time.
Why would anyone do that?
To create a longer, more ancient history, perhaps. Leaving gaps where those events originally were, it elongates the timeline.
Okay, if that's the framework, then the whole idea of the Dark Ages gets completely flipped, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Instead of decline, where science rolls back to the Stone Age,
Yeah.
the new chronology sees it as the Naissance, the birth of civilization, the time when our cultural and historical values were actually being created
Yeah.
gradually.
So not dark at all, more like foundational.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The foundation that was later attributed, mistakenly, to a much earlier classical age, it inverts the whole picture.
Okay, let's talk about Rome then, the heart of that supposed classical age. New Chronology says there was a mysterious renaissance of classical stuff happening in the Middle Ages in Rome.
Right. Not centuries before. And a key piece of evidence they point to is that ancient institutions, like the Roman Senate, the consulate,
Yeah, the famous ones.
they were still apparently functioning in medieval Rome, even into the 10th century.
But weren't they supposed to have been destroyed centuries earlier with the fall of the Western Empire?
That's the traditional story.
Hmm.
But if they were still active in the 10th century, it suggests they were medieval institutions, not ancient ones that somehow survived.
What about artifacts? Like specific things?
Good question. Take the famous statue of Marcus Aurelius on horseback, traditionally dated around 170 AD.
Iconic image of Rome.
Totally. But the sources we're looking at claim it was actually cast in the 11th century by order of Pope Clemens III.
The 11th century, that's a massive shift. How do mainstream historians explain that away?
Well, someone like Gregorovius apparently just dismissed it, said the work was too good for the barbaric Middle Ages. Basically, medieval artists couldn't possibly have been that skilled.
So the dating relies on an assumption about medieval skill levels.
That seems to be the counter-argument presented, yeah.
Any other examples like that?
Yes, Tintoretto's drawing from the 16th century. It shows Emperor Vitellius.
Who traditionally lived way back in 69 AD.
Exactly. But the new chronology suggests maybe Vitellius was actually a 16th century ruler who died around 1519, and Tintoretto drew him then as recently deceased.
Okay, that fits the time frame. But what about the date on the drawing?
Yeah. The drawing has the number 1263 on it.
Which makes no sense for either date, right? 69 AD or 1519 AD.
Right. But the theory interprets that 1263 not as an error, but as evidence that different dating systems, different chronologies, were still being used in the 16th century. History wasn't fixed yet.
So multiple timelines coexisting, that's wild.
It challenges our idea of a single linear past. And look at the Hereford map. It shows Emperor Augustus
The ancient Roman emperor.
wearing a medieval crown with a Christian cross on it, which implies he lived no earlier than the 13th century when such crowns were used.
Visual contradictions again. Okay, what about the texts themselves, the ancient writings?
Well, they bring up the practicalities. Parchment. Making it was incredibly difficult and expensive.
Right. Animal skins, scraping,
Yeah,
a lot of work.
a ton of work.
Yeah.
So the argument goes, if texts were truly ancient, from a time when parchment was that scarce, wouldn't they be? Well, brief, and maybe written in a simpler language.
Less flowery, perhaps. More functional.
Possibly. The very polished, complex literary style of many ancient texts, they argue, suggests a later time, a time when writing materials were more common and language had evolved.
Okay, that's a practical argument. Let's shift to Greece, Athens. Mainstream history talks about an impenetrable darkness there for centuries, right? Like 6th to 10th century?
Yes, Scaligean history, as they call it, paints that picture. The odd thing is, there's no real evidence Athens was destroyed then.
So what does New Chronology say happened?
They suggest those ancient buildings were very much in use, but as something else. The Parthenon, for instance.
The symbol of ancient Greece.
They claim it was functioning as a Latin Christian temple in the 12th century, dedicated to the Virgin Mary, who they say was sort of equated with Athena.
A Christian church inside the Parthenon. Wow.
And the Erechtheum, the Temple of Theseus, also apparently active Christian churches in the 13th century.
That completely reframes how you'd view those sites.
It does. And they add that the word Hellenes, the term for Greeks, only really reappeared in the 15th century.
So who was living there in the late Middle Ages?
They suggest Avaroslavs, not people identifying as descendants of ancient Greeks.
Okay, this leads to something about restoration work in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Yes, this is a critical point.
Yeah.
The idea is that these later restorations in Athens weren't just fixing things up.
What were they doing then?
They were, according to the source, zealously destroying Ottoman and medieval structures on the Acropolis. Why? Because they were seen as ugly. They didn't fit the desired ancient image.
So tidying up history by removing the inconvenient bits?
That's the accusation. They even claimed the stonework, the masonry, of the foundation for the Temple of Athena Nike
Yeah.
was identical to nearby medieval towers, suggesting they were built at the same time, maybe 15th or 16th century. And later restorers Basically cleared away the medieval stuff to make the temple look purely ancient,
Creating the aesthetic they wanted to see.
kind of like historical landscaping. And they mentioned the Laocoon statue restoration in 1960 as another example.
What happened there?
Apparently, restorers deliberately broke off arms from the statue
They broke them off.
and replaced them with a fragment someone found, which was declared to be a perfect match for the ancient original, even though it meant damaging the existing statue to fit this supposedly correct but maybe newly found piece.
That sounds arbitrary. An improvement that involved breaking things.
It raises questions about how objective restoration can be, doesn't it? If you can just decide what looks ancient and make it fit.
Definitely. And if restorations can be that subjective, it kind of opens the door to the idea of more deliberate manipulation, right?
Yeah.
Forgery and editing.
Which is a huge pillar of the new chronology theory.
Yeah.
They argue that forgery wasn't just occasional, but pervasive.
Okay, so who are these alleged forgers or editors? They name names.
Oh, yeah. They point fingers at some very famous figures, like Petrarch, the 14th century Italian humanist, often called the father of the Renaissance.
Right. Famous for reviving classical texts.
Well, the new chronology offers a different take. They claim Petrarch essentially invented the legend of a glorious ancient Rome based in Italy.
Invented it. How?
By taking events that they say really happened in Constantinople, which they argue was the real major Roman city of the time, the city of the czars,
Okay.
and transferring those stories, that history, onto the relatively small Italian town of Rome, basically creating its ancient pedigree out of whole cloth, or rather out of Constantinople's cloth.
That's a bold claim. What about his famous ancient correspondence?
Yes. Petrarch wrote letters seemingly to figures like Cicero, Livy, Socrates, long dead, right?
Right.
The claim here is astonishing, that these weren't letters to the long dead. They were letters to Petrarch's contemporaries who just happened to have names like Livy or Socrates.
Because they were living in what Petrarch considered the classical age, which was, then, in the 14th century.
That's the mind-bending idea,
Yeah.
that the classical age wasn't ancient history for Petrarch. It was his present or very recent past.
Okay, my head hurts a little. What about Tacitus,
Yeah.
the Roman historian? His works were famously rediscovered.
Yes, supposedly rediscovered in the 15th century by another humanist, Poggio Bracciolini.
And the new chronology questions this discovery.
Big time. They highlight all the weird circumstances, Poggio being cagey about where he found it, his delays, the fact the original manuscript mysteriously disappeared.
Sounds suspicious.
And critics, even back then, like Hochart and Ross, apparently accused Poggio of forgery outright. Plus, Poggio had been linked to other forgeries before.
Like what?
Something called the Commentaries of Q. Asconius Pedianus. Apparently no one ever saw the original document for that either, so his track record wasn't exactly spotless, according to this view.
So a pattern of convenient discoveries by people with maybe questionable histories?
That's the picture they paint. And it's not just humanists. They bring in a German critic, Wilhelm Kammeyer.
Okay, who is he?
He was a lawyer, and he analyzed medieval documents like legal deeds, donation charters, and he claimed to find evidence of universal falsification of history. Things like documents missing dates, or claiming an emperor was in two different distant cities on the same day, or donation records without the recipient's name even mentioned.
Sloppy work or something more.
Kammeyer concluded it was deliberate, that hoaxers systematically destroyed original documents and replaced them with fakes.
Again, why? What was the motive this time?
Two main reasons, according to Kammeyer's interpretation. One, to hide or distort pre-Christian history. Two, to legitimize feudal property rights that might have been gained through violence. You invent an ancient deed from a made-up king, suddenly your land grab looks legal.
Create the paperwork to match the reality you want.
Pretty much. And to support this idea of later editing, the new chronology points to things found in supposedly ancient texts.
Like what?
Christian symbols, crosses, coats of arms, appearing in illustrations within texts attributed to ancient authors like Titus Livy.
How does mainstream history explain those?
Often as later editions by medieval illustrators, maybe to please a Christian patron.
What new chronology says?
They say no, this is proof the texts themselves are medieval. The illustrations reflect the time they were actually created.
Okay, this is all building a picture of potentially massive historical revision. And it gets even more provocative when they talk about religion, right?
Oh, absolutely. This might be the most shocking part. They propose something called the Bacchic-Christian cult.
Bacchic-Christian, like Dionysus and Jesus mixed together.
Essentially, yes. The claim is that the ancient Dionysian or Bacchic pagan cult wasn't ancient paganism at all.
What was it then?
It was, in fact, a form of medieval Western European Christianity flourishing between the 13th and 16th centuries.
So paganism and Christianity weren't separate opposing forces back then. They were the same thing or related.
Or at least strands of the same evolving tradition. They cite research by N.A. Morozov, pointing to evidence of, well, very Bacchic practices within Christian services in medieval Italy and France.
Like what kind of practices?
Things like liturgies turning into orgies, convents functioning as houses of ill repute.
Seriously, in convents?
That's the claim cited. And the term agapes, those Christian love suppers, they argue the original Greek meant erotic love, not just brotherly love, suggesting these suppers were different than we imagine.
Wow.
Okay.
That paints a very different picture of medieval piety.
It certainly does. And then there's the art, medieval art in cathedrals, Notre Dame, Magdeburg Cathedral, showing images we definitely call obscene today. Naked women riding goats, monkeys playing guitars, even phallic symbols carved into the stonework.
I think I've heard about some of those. Gargoyles and weird carvings.
Right. The usual explanation is they're caricatures or warnings against sin, maybe just folk art.
Makes sense.
But the new chronology says no. These weren't warnings. They were just depictions of everyday life at the time, quotidian phenomena. Or even, get this, literal signs for legal brothels. Maybe even ones for married women, located inside the church grounds or temples.
A sign for a brothel on a cathedral. That's hard to imagine.
It suggests a completely different moral landscape, doesn't it? More open, more libertine.
Definitely. And what about links between pagan gods and Christ?
Well, they bring up Arthur Drews, a specialist in comparative religion. He argued that many cults we think of as pre-Christian, like Attis, Adonis, Osiris.
The dying and rising god types.
Exactly. Drews argued they aren't pre-Christian influences on Christianity. Instead, they are parallels or maybe even repercussions of the cult of Jesus Christ, which they place around the 12th century. Meaning, Christianity came first and influenced these pagan stories.
So the influence flows the other way.
That's the argument. And they show visual examples. A Celtic stone with Isis, Jesus carved on it. An Assyrian king with a Christian cross on his chest. A Phoenician goddess, Astarte, holding a scepter topped with a Christian cross. Even Buddha, depicted with a Christian symbol, a Gamadian cross.
Trying to show Christian symbols were present much earlier or in different contexts than we think.
Or that these contexts weren't actually pre-Christian at all. And they draw strong parallels between Mithraism and Christianity.
Mithras, the Roman soldier god cult.
Right. They say it's virtually identical to medieval Christianity. Things like the Vatican being a key sanctuary for both, the title pater for priests, the Pope's tiara being like the Mithraic mitre, red shoes, keys, purgatory, similar ceremonies.
So not just similar, but maybe the same tradition evolving.
That's the suggestion. Not parallel evolution, but a shared origin, much later than usually thought.
Okay, let's jump to Egypt. More anomalies there.
According to this theory, yes, they point to Christian symbols, crosses and ankhs, which they interpret as a form of cross appearing on supposedly ancient Egyptian gods like Ra, Osiris, Tefnut, and even on a pharaoh's throne.
Crosses on pharaohs' thrones.
That's what they show pictures of. And beyond symbols, they claim some ancient Egyptian art actually depicts Christian scenes.
Like what?
The Annunciation, the Immaculate Conception, the birth of Christ. They see these as clear evidence the art is much later than the dynastic periods.
So Egyptian art showing New Testament scenes.
That's the interpretation offered. And even the famous obelisks.
Transported to Rome and Paris.
Exactly. They argue these weren't ancient pagan monuments repurposed by Christians. They were built much later, maybe 16th to 18th centuries, specifically to be tall pedestals for Christian symbols.
Built for the crosses, not just topped with them later.
Right. And then there's St. Mark, the evangelist.
Traditionally 1st century AD. Wrote one of the Gospels.
New chronology says, nope, he lived and died in the 12th century.
The 12th. How do they account for his relics in Venice?
The miraculous rediscovery of his body in Venice in 1094 AD. They say that wasn't a rediscovery. That was his actual, very opulent burial, which was later backdated by centuries.
Goodness. Okay, so the scale of this revision isn't just Europe and the Mediterranean. It goes global.
It does. They touch on India, for example, arguing that ancient Indian history lacks reliably dated monuments and its own coherent historical literature.
Meaning
it ends up relying heavily on the European timeline, the Scaligerine chronology, to date its own past. Without that European framework, its ancient history becomes much vaguer.
And they connect Krishna to Christ again.
Yeah, drawing parallels and suggesting the main Krishna texts might actually date from around the 12th century AD, possibly influenced by Christian missionaries of that time.
So, again, flipping the direction of influence.
Right. They even say huge events, like Alexander the Great's invasion of India, seem to have left barely any trace in native Indian traditions, suggesting maybe it was inserted later or misattributed.
Okay, so pulling it all together, the core idea is a massive systematic editing of history.
That's the claim, that most original documents from the 11th to 16th centuries were heavily edited, tendentiously edited, in the 16th and 17th centuries.
Creating this elongation of history you mentioned.
Exactly, stretching the timeline backwards. And interestingly, documents that mainstream historians do consider forgeries, like the famous Gift of Constantine.
The one supposedly giving the Pope power over the Western Empire.
That's the one, widely seen as an 8th or 9th century forgery. But under the new chronology, it's considered authentic because it fits perfectly into their revised, much later timeline of when those political events actually occurred.
So their authentic is the mainstream forgery, and vice versa sometimes.
It completely flips the script on what's considered genuine evidence.
Okay, after laying out all these, frankly, staggering claims, how on earth has the academic world, mainstream historians, archaeologists, how have they reacted?
Well, to put it mildly, not favorably. The response has been pretty much universal rejection.
Just dismissed it.
It's generally branded as pseudoscience, not just a differing opinion, but fundamentally flawed in its methods and conclusions.
Yeah.
It's seen as an attack on the disciplines of history and archaeology.
But it has found some supporters, right? You mentioned Garry Kasparov.
Yes, the former world chess champion. Apparently, he helped popularize it, partly because he shared a skepticism about the traditional Dark Ages. He found it illogical that so much knowledge, especially military knowledge, seemed to just disappear between the ancient world and the Byzantine era.
So he saw a logical gap that the theory seemed to fill for him.
That seems to be the connection, yeah.
What are the specific criticisms from academics against Fomenko's methods?
A major one is about statistics. Critics accuse Fomenko of basically cherry-picking data, finding historical parallels that fit his theory while ignoring ones that contradict it, and manipulating its statistical methods themselves to create apparent correlations that aren't really valid.
Like finding patterns where there aren't any.
Or forcing patterns, yes. Violating the rules of statistical analysis, they'd say.
What about astronomy? That seems like hard data. Eclipses, planetary positions.
Right. Astronomy is usually seen as a key anchor for ancient dating. But Fomenko challenges that too. For example, lunar acceleration, the moon speeding up slightly over centuries.
Okay.
Mainstream astronomers, like Robert Newton, have explanations for observed irregularities. But Fomenko apparently achieves a constant acceleration by just discarding eclipse records he deems anomalous, the ones that don't fit his model.
So throwing out the data that contradicts the theory.
That's the criticism. Mainstream scientists say those anomalies are real and need explaining, not eliminating.
And what about things like Ptolemy's Almagest, the ancient star catalog?
Huge point of contention. Mainstream scholars date it to around 150 AD based on the star positions. Fomenko claims it must have been compiled much later, 15th or 16th century, using data from the 9th to 16th centuries.
A massive difference. How do mainstream scholars counter the idea of missing centuries?
They point to things like Babylonian astronomical diaries, clay tablets with detailed observations of eclipses and planets, allowing them to accurately date events back to maybe 600 BCE, which directly contradicts the idea of huge phantom periods later on.
So independent astronomical records seem to refute the timeline shift.
That's the mainstream position, yes. Though Fomenko's side would argue about the interpretation or dating of those records, too.
It sounds like a fundamental clash of methodologies.
Very much so. And there's also criticism about dating methods themselves, like radiocarbon dating.
What's the issue there?
Critics of the mainstream sometimes point to a potential circulus viciosus, a vicious cycle. The idea that sometimes, maybe subconsciously, archaeologists might give the dating lab an expected age range for a sample, and the lab, perhaps also subconsciously, might process the data in a way that aligns with that expectation.
So the result confirms the assumption, creating a circle.
That's the concern raised by critics, that it's not always a blind test. Mainstream labs, of course, have protocols to prevent this, but the suspicion is raised by Fomenko's side.
Okay, beyond the science and history methods, are there political dimensions to this?
Yes, that's come up too. Some critics see the new chronology, originating in Russia, as potentially linked to a kind of renewed Russian imperial ideology, or Eurasianism.
How so?
Well, some interpretations of Fomenko's work suggest, for instance, that Russia and Turkey were once part of the same vast empire, the Russian horde, which dominated Eurasia. Some see this as rewriting history to create a grander, more central role for Russia in the past.
So history being used to bolster national identity or geopolitical narratives.
That's certainly an interpretation some commentators have put forward. It shows how tangled history can get with present-day politics.
And Fomenko himself, has he responded to these criticisms? Is he willing to change his mind?
Well, the publishers afterward in the source material lays out specific conditions. Fomenko and his colleagues say they're ready to retract.
Okay.
If radiocarbon dating passes specific black box tests they propose, or if astronomy definitively refutes their calculations on ancient eclipses, or if the astrophysicist Robert Newton's work on lunar acceleration is proven wrong.
Those sound like very high bars. Almost demanding mainstream science proves itself wrong, according to his criteria.
Pretty much. As the source notes, historians and scientists generally don't engage on those terms because they consider their methods already validated within their own framework, so it creates a bit of an impasse.
Yeah, a dialogue seems difficult there. So stepping back, this whole deep dive, it's really laid bare the sheer scale, the audacity of the new chronology.
It's monumental, questioning thousands of years of history across continents, civilizations, Rome, Greece, Egypt, India, China.
It's like an intellectual earthquake shaking the very foundations of how we understand the past.
Absolutely, and it forces you to think about the nature of history itself. If the past really is just a model built on records that, as this theory claims, can be so easily manipulated or misinterpreted or forged.
Yeah, what does that mean? For our sense of identity, for national stories, even how we see the world today.
What would it actually feel like if history begins today wasn't just a philosophical idea, but almost literally true? If centuries of what we thought was ancient history were actually folded into much more recent times?
How much of what we think we know about where we came from might just be, well, a carefully constructed illusion if this theory holds any water?
It's a profoundly unsettling thought, isn't it? Really pushes you to look critically at any historical narrative you encounter. Where did it come from? Who wrote it? And why?
Definitely leaves you with a lot to think about. Thanks for unpacking such a complex and controversial topic.
My pleasure. It's certainly one that challenges assumptions,